Under international law, the island of Hong Kong and part of Kowloon on the mainland formed a permanent British possession. But the adjoining new territories had only been leased to Britain, and the lease was to run out in 1997. As that date approached, the diplomats began to fret.
No one could put a precise year to it or date to it, but it was clear that if before long we hadn't got to some understanding with China about Hong Kong, then confidence would begin to to diminish in Hong Kong. And once that began, the process of loss of confidence could be quite rapid.
And the decision was eventually taken that in early 1979, an opportunity arose, a very, very rare, unique opportunity. The governor of Hong Kong, for the first time since 1949, was invited to pay an official visit to China.
The governor, Murray McElhose, met China's leader Deng Xiaoping in the Great Hall of the People. He was mightily impressed.
Oh, very strong magic, no question. I've met Zhou Enlai, and that was very strong magic. But Deng was different. Bright eyes, forceful speech. I suppose somehow the magic was a little, maybe I made up for myself, because he was one of the most powerful men in the world. I mean, more powerful than almost any other, because of the size of the country he was governing.
We barely got sat down before Deng launched off into Hong Kong and said, of course, Hong Kong will return to China, sovereignty is China's, it will return, but 97 is quite a while off, we could have some talks before then, but whatever happens, we will look after the special quality or characteristics of Hong Kong, just as we will with Taiwan. He lumped the two together. And he ended up by saying investors in Hong Kong should set their hearts at ease.
Hong Kong was worried. Although the colony had been ceded to Britain in perpetuity, China described the relevant treaties as invalid. The governor sought to reassure the public that though there'd been no agreement in Beijing, the colony's unique status was safe in Britain's hands.
Over a period, we've moved from a situation of frigid hostility, which was abnormal and basically dangerous, into a situation of friendship and normalcy.
Some critics thought the governor had sold a pass in Beijing.
There is a train of criticism, which is that somehow or other we threw away a bargaining position by raising this at all. In fact, and that the Chinese might have drifted past 1997, because after all they'd never accepted the treaties as valid. One or two people have written in this sense. And this is bunkum. I mean, the mind boggles. And that how anybody could suggest that this was the right and subtle way to go about it, I don't know.
The question of Hong Kong did not surface again until 1982, immediately after the war in the Falklands.
We had indeed achieved a great victory by restoring British sovereignty over the Falklands. Margaret Thatcher was due to go to Hong Kong within months of that great success. And yet the case we had to present to her, to ourselves, to all of us, was that Hong Kong was a place where British sovereignty was by definition going to run out. Margaret's heart kept on cherishing the alternative and dreaming of a way in which we could have something more permanent, more durable. Heart and mind were constantly in conflict, and one had to keep on restoring the sovereignty of mind over heart.
Yes, I would have loved to have held Hong Kong Island for Britain. It would have been just an extra reassurance, because people could see then that there would be a comparison between the way we did things and the way that mainland China did things.
The Prime Minister was a problem for the diplomats.
We were extremely well aware of the Prime Minister's view. After all, don't forget that this was taking place against the background of the Falklands. She was not in any mood to be told things she didn't want to hear.
The last thing that Margaret Thatcher wanted to be told was that she, of all people, would have to surrender the sovereignty of Hong Kong. The new territories, yes, they had to go back in 1997, but Hong Kong was different. Her advisors persisted. They told her about this street, because Boundary Street was the dividing line between territory owned by Britain on that side and territory leased from China on this side. The evidence they presented was stark. Even if the People's Liberation Army refrained from marching across what would become the border in 1997, the People's Republic of China could very easily snuff out the lights of Hong Kong with the flick of a switch.
Look at the map. We had no option. Hong Kong Island is but a small percent, less than 5% of the area of the whole of Hong Kong. All the rest is China mainland. Now, there's no way in which we could say we're going to keep the sovereignty of Hong Kong. There's no way in which we could defend it. More than that, they didn't need to march in. The Chinese could just have turned off the supply of water.
Thatcher paid her first visit to Beijing knowing that China had the upper hand, but hopeful that Beijing would honor the original treaties ceding Hong Kong to Britain.
She had no love of China. Unlike most of the people who'd been feasted and wined and dined up in Peking, she didn't love China. She made no secret of that. So it wasn't her favorite place. And she was very worried about allowing millions of people under British tutelage, under British control, to pass under Chinese control.
China's paramount leader greeted her in the Great Hall of the People.
It was an interesting encounter because both the leaders were a bit uncertain, a bit uneasy with the other. Mrs. Thatcher, despite herself, was overawed by this figure sitting there, tough, smoking, making occasional dismissive gestures, a figure of almost unlimited authority and someone from a totally alien political environment.
I can only put it this way. He's a very concentrated man. He's small, not very tall, quite an impressive bone structure and strong face. But the volume of personality compared to the physical volume makes the personality even more obvious and very much in charge. Oh, very much.
When they got down to business, they had what diplomats call a frank exchange of views.
When I was talking to him and said we had done so well for the people of Hong Kong and therefore of China, that could we keep the sovereignty of Hong Kong Island and the administration. And he said, look, I could walk in and take the whole lot this afternoon. And I said, yes, you could. And there's nothing I could do to stop you. But the eyes of the world would now know what China was like. Everything would leave Hong Kong. You would have taken prosperity, and you would have suddenly lost the lot.
Was she good at putting herself inside his mind, the better to deal with it?
I wouldn't say that was one of her outstanding attributes.
But toughness was. To the dismay of the diplomats, she did not shrink from challenging Beijing in public.
I think if you say that you don't like a treaty, then if ever you're to have certainty that any other treaty you make will have the confidence of the other side, you can't just abrogate one. After all, if you abrogate one, why should anyone believe you that you're serious about another? Our responsibility is to those 5 million people who've put their faith in us, who've lived under British administration for a long time, and who've flourished under British administration.
But she left without making progress, and after what the Chinese interpreted as a symbolic, if unintentional, gesture. However, despite her setback in Beijing, Thatcher still hoped that Hong Kong might remain British.
I was negotiating with Chinese communists, so it was going to be very tough. And yes, they held a lot of cards, but I held an ace: our performance in the governance of Chinese people in Hong Kong.
British officialdom harboured no such illusion. The diplomats were certain that China would insist on the return of Hong Kong, and that Britain's only option was to get out on the best terms available.
We are dealing with a very proud people who wish to recover national territory which had been lost under humiliating circumstances as they saw it, and they had no doubt which came first. It was recovering the territory. Naturally, they would like to recover it in prosperous circumstances and to get economic benefits as well. Like everyone, they would like to have their cake and eat it. But they made it very plain that if it came to the crunch, they were prepared to recover the place as a wasteland.
In July 1983, the new Foreign Secretary was dispatched to Beijing to make the opening moves.
My biggest aspirational desire is to live up to the year 1997.
China was committed, for a whole range of historic reasons, to recovering its sovereignty. And there was no stopping that, whatever we tried to do. We couldn't stop it by force or by appeal to world opinion or anything of that sort.
And then on cue, and as if to prove the point, China rattled the sabres.
There was a major financial crisis that autumn. The Hong Kong dollar fell through the floor, and the Chinese refused any help in propping it up. And indeed, the Bank of China was speculating against us in the currency. In a situation like that, one where the Chinese had overwhelming superiority in terms of influence, power, cards, we had to negotiate for the best we could get. If there was to be a retreat, it had to be an orderly retreat from one carefully defended point to another.
That retreat went from losing sovereignty to losing administration to China's bottom line. After 2 years of negotiation, the Joint Declaration of 1984. Thatcher was never enthusiastic.
And she came slowly and reluctantly along the path that, in fact, we followed, that the Joint Declaration was the best we could do in very difficult circumstances. It would be the best protection we could give Hong Kong.
I would have liked Hong Kong Island to be sovereign and for them to have their independence and to be a small member of the United Nations, but China wouldn't have that.
In Hong Kong, and more widely, the Joint Declaration was regarded as a triumph of diplomacy, though there were some who charged Britain with appeasement.
To march out, to kick over the table and say, we are going home, these are intolerable demands you're putting on us, might have caused the adrenaline to flow for a minute or two and given momentary satisfaction, particularly perhaps in the British press, but in serious terms it would have been childish, irresponsible, self-indulgent. We couldn't contemplate it.
So your response to those who said that you led a humiliating retreat, the kowtower in chief, would be what?
They know nothing about it.
The principle underlying the Joint Declaration was the phrase "one country, two systems." Hong Kong would retain its existing freedoms and would be allowed to hold elections. There was much debate and dispute about what form those elections should take, what kind of democracy, and how fast. Then came the